Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. Sunday, the 22nd of December, nearly Christmas time. Anyway, good to be back here. Hope you're doing well. Welcome back, as I said, to the channel. In this week's live stream, I'm going to explore a new music idea featuring Ableton Live's Drift synthesizer, maybe a bit of the new SQ sequencer, and for sure a host of other fun stuff. Thinking like modulating modulators and automating snapshots maybe as well. Let's see what I can come up with in a couple of hours. As always, feel free to drop your questions in the chat and we'll learn and discover some new things together. My goal, as always, to help you level up your skills and become a better music producer. So without further ado, let's dive into today's stream. Let's just close up a couple of windows here. Hopefully you can already hear the microphone okay. Xavi Diaz, buenas tardes, good afternoon, a very good afternoon to you. And also a quick one as well, a very big thank you to those of you who have participated in a little poll I've been running, both in my community tab on YouTube and here in the chat, where I asked the question, which of these Ableton Live synths would you like to learn from? And I listed Drift, Wavetable. Unfortunately, I ran out of space, so Operator and Analog were on the same page, so I was only allowed 4 options in the poll: Drift, Wavetable, Operator, Analog combined, and Meld. So the results here in the chat are Drift 50%, Wavetable 25%, and Operator Analog 25%, which is always interesting, and Meld 0. The community tab one's still going, and I think the last time I looked it was around 50 Meld, 50 Drift. So feel free to also interact there in the community section of my page, my YouTube channel. And of course, what you can do there is write also in the comments something specific about those synths that you would like to learn, which unfortunately I forgot to elaborate on. So if you'd like to do that here in today's chat while we're going, feel free to do that as well. So just test out a little bit of audio. I've got a track of mine here just to have a quick play of some levels, make sure we've got some audio action. So let's just make sure we have that. So let's try that again. And we will grab ourselves a limiter for YouTube, pop it on the master, just in case we need to boost any volumes. All right, that's probably enough of a demo of that little track that I've been working on there. And as I said, it's mainly to test the audio. So limiter on the master track. Thank you, as I said, for participating in those polls. So what I thought I would do, looking at that, as I said, in both the community tab and now the chat, I see that Drift is at the top. So why don't we do a bit of drifting today? Let's get stuck into that and see about making an idea using the Drift synth. I feel like Drift is a bit of a sleeper in the analog instrument, sorry, in the Ableton instrument folder, the synth folder. It kind of came to me at a funny time where, you know, I thought we already had lots of great instruments to work with, which I still do in Ableton Live, but obviously they're always developing and changing and updating things. And I felt like Drift kind of snuck into my instrument folder without me really needing it or deep diving in it too much. I was already comfortable working with Wavetable and Operator and Analog and getting the sounds I wanted from those, and of course third-party things. So I think sometimes, in my case, talking from my own personal experience, I have had a Drift, and Drift has been in the instrument folder, but I haven't kind of pushed it to all the limits that it can do. So let's explore it a bit together, shall we? I think that's probably a good plan. So I'm going to get rid of that audio track I used to just kickstart today's audio levels. I'm sure it's working. Xavi Diaz, nice groove, promising. Thank you very much. Well, obviously you heard it, so that's a good start. That's the only reason it's really appearing there. So as I said, let's begin with a bit of Drift, and let's go from there. So let's go to the instrument folder of Ableton, grab ourselves an instance of Drift, and let's maybe start with something like a bit of either a chord or a sequence or something like that. So I can show you a few tricks with Drift using it, let's say maybe to make some chords. So let's just fire up the default sounds here. And let's maybe get stuck into just a simple chord progression, just so we can take a look at the drift itself. Let's have a look at the BPM. We're in 124 based on the track that I played of mine, so we could live with that for a moment. Maybe key-wise, we might change that in a second. Let's just say that we start with the maybe 164 type chord progression, so just a simple 3 chords. So let's maybe plug that in. So if we're in C major, we would be on the C as the starting note, and then we jump up to the 4 or the 6. So if we go right up to the 6, we would be on the A, and then we could jump back down to the E, or the F, sorry. So that would be a 164. Let's maybe also get ourselves into a couple of bars here. Probably could even do 4 bars, but let's say we do something like 2 bars for now. Let's bring this over into the second bar. Something like this. We'll revoice these in a second. So let's maybe have that all the way over there. And maybe that's somewhere in there, but we might change that rhythm as well in a moment. Let's get some triads happening here, just regular triads for the moment of these 3 chords. And a 164 chord, by the way, is kind of a good beginner chord progression to kind of start with, that you can layer lots of things over, such as vocals. It fits with a lot of vocals. The 2 tricky chords, if you're working a major scale, is the 7th chord, and if you're in a minor scale, it's the 2nd chord of the whatever key and scale you choose. They're ones that when you're beginning to do chord progressions, you might want to sort of best avoid those to start with. So we've just revoiced those a little bit here, so we're sharing the C at the bottom here, which means they're kind of voiced quite smoothly. So we've just got some simple chords. Now let's maybe have some drums to go with that as well. So we might just set up a little bit of drums that we can come back and work on in a moment, but mainly as we're looking at drift, we can kind of just get started with some kind of basic drums here. So maybe a bit of minimal house kind of type drums here. Just a simple program with a drum rack. Let's have a listen to that. That'll just give us something to work with for now, drum wise. And as I said, we can work on that in a bit, but it's just good to get going here, as I said, mainly as you guys and girls seemed interested in drift. Well, let's sort of make that the main focus here. So we've got some chords. We're in C major. Maybe we can change that a little bit. So if we change our root notes, let's say we're doing house, we could do E minor perhaps as a change. So if we come up here to our scale awareness, let's go E minor. And then what we could do is just take all our chords that we've already set up here, and then we can say ask Ableton to fit them to scale using the MIDI tools over here. So in pitch and time, so we've moved our root note from C major up to the E, and we've now going to change it to a minor scale. We could say fit that to the scale. So we've now got the following chords. And maybe what we could do here is turn this first chord into a 7th chord. So add the extension on the top. This could give us a bit of voice leading downwards. Let's try that. And also we could try this one. Let's see what it feels like if we come down. Well, then we actually, yeah, we have the same chord, so we don't really want to do that. But we could also revoice this one slightly. Let's try it like so. Yeah, so we've got a proper downwards voicing here, which kind of keeps it a little bit you know, with a little bit of feeling, a little bit of direction, revoiced, reworking here for E minor as the root. Adrian Dantas, good afternoon to you. Hey, when will we be able to subscribe to your techno music production online course? That's a great question. I haven't got a specific course launching for techno, but maybe Adrian, have a look for my email at the bottom of my either here in YouTube. It's in my description or in the video description actually at the bottom, and just shoot us an email and I'll update you with some news about that. But yeah, I've got a lot of sort of coaching courses that I do, or two main coaching courses I do, but I'd be happy to talk to you about that for sure. All right, so let's crack on here. Thanks for your question and a very good afternoon. So let's get a bit of velocity randomization into these notes here, just so they're a little bit more vibey than they are currently. We'll bring it down so it's not super heavy between the different notes. And we'll leave them changing on the beat for now, but we could play around with that in a little bit. So drift, here it is down here in all its glory. So what we could do as perhaps a starting point is just take a look at how you can kind of maybe do a bit of a fake delay in the synth itself. So I did recently a 3-part synthesis series where I went through like how to make your own sounds with synthesis. And one of the tips I gave in that series, which I can link somewhere here to the different the playlist of those three-part series, but one of the tips I gave during that series was talking about when it got to the modulating part 3 version of that series, I spoke a lot about trying to get out of the synth itself the sort of FX type feeling, the movement, the variation, the dynamics actually in the synth itself by using modulation, rather than just going behind the synth here and adding lots of your favorite effects. Of course, that's another technique, but we can kind of get some more interest here, including a bit of a fake delay by using things that we have already access to here in the synth. So let's start by turning our filter frequency down on the drift. So we're going to make it nice and kind of like dark like that for a second. Let's look around at what else we've got on the drift. We've got ourself in poly at the moment, which is polyphonic mode. That's going to be fine for the fact we're playing chords. So we've got up to 32 voices of notes we could be playing together. So that sort of suits what we're doing at the moment. We don't need too much else on this side here for now. But what we want to do now is come across and just take a look a little bit at our envelopes. Also, we can leave the oscillators alone for the moment. Oscillator 1 and 2, just leave them as they are for the moment. Oscillator 1, envelope 1 is the volume envelope for this particular sound now, so maybe we'll give it a little bit longer release. We might make the sustain all the way at a bit more slower attack. Let's just balance our volumes a little bit. We want the drift up a bit. Let's have a little bit of resonance. So right now, if we look at the drift, envelope 1 is controlling the amp envelope. That's by default here. We've got an LFO section over here, which is currently not actually doing anything, but it's ready to do something. And similarly on the filter, so we've got ourselves a nice low pass filter here, or high cut, that's currently cutting off all the high frequency. So we can think of this like a subtractive synth at the moment. It's just filtering away the harmonics we're developing with our 2 oscillators over here, which you can kind of see down in this little window down here on the drift, which I do love about it, that if we're changing parameters in here, you can kind of see the waveform you're working with. Right, so we can kind of see the harmonics. We don't see it post the filter, but we can see the waveform we've got that we are filtering. So we're working in very much a subtractive synth, analog synth sort of world here with what we're doing at the moment. So looking at that, we've got resonance, we've got filter frequency, we've got a high pass filter as well if we want to add in the mix, so we can also cut the low ends. Not going to worry about that for now. And then if you look down the bottom, you can see that the filter frequency currently has two sections that it can be modulated. We can modulate this cutoff here in two ways currently, and currently envelope 2 is already being applied to the filter frequency cutoff. So every time my chords re-trigger these notes, it starts here, 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 and here, that is making this envelope 2, which we can see down here, that is giving a little bit of opening and closing of the filter frequency. So let's have a listen if we adjust a bit the envelope 2. So that's pretty standard stuff. There's a nice little bit of movement in there and there's a nice bit of shape in there. But what we want to do is kind of bring the LFO into the action here. So what I'd like to do is kind of bring the LFO to modulate that filter frequency a bit. So let's look at the second tab that's currently, if we had an MPE keyboard available to us, which I don't in front of me at this point in time, we'd be able to use pressure on the keyboard to modulate the filter a bit. We're going to change that. We're going to say, let's have the LFO coming in there. And let's say we go 100% LFO onto the modulating the filter frequency, and we leave it currently exactly how it was by default. And by default, it's a sine wave, it's in hertz, so it's in frequency rate, and the amount it's being applied is 100%. So 100% of that sine wave is now going to modulate this filter frequency. So let's speed up the rate a bit. So that's already interesting. We've now got two things working together. We've got a bit of envelope every time the notes, the chords happen. That's opening and closing around this cutoff. And now we've got, in combination with that, an LFO. Let's play around with the LFO a bit, and let's start by saying, let's change the shape of it to something like maybe a sawtooth down. And instead of it, well, let's listen to that as it is. So remember, we're thinking about a bit of a fake delay here sort of vibe. So you're thinking, oh, someone's put a delay on this. Almost there, but let's note sync that sawtooth down. And let's now play around with the amount of the LFO. So all those things are kind of working nicely in combination with each other. But now is where we could bring a little bit of modulating the modulator in. So right now we've got this combination of a 16th synced saw down LFO applied 100% to this filter cutoff, and we've got an envelope every time the chords trigger. We also, what we might do is also make sure that our LFO re-triggers every time it finishes its cycle. If we don't have retrigger on, it can recycle anywhere within the waveform. So if we get retrigger on, it makes sure it always begins from the same point in the cycle, the start of that waveform. So now let's see, if we look alongside the amount of the LFO, we can see straight away that we could essentially decide that something else now modulates the amount, how much of this LFO. So I'll just do it with the mouse first. So as you can probably hear, that's making those chords pretty sexy. It's kind of got this nice movement to it now. It sounds a bit like, as I said, we've got a delay going on that's being caused by the saw down synced LFO modulating the filter frequency. Pretty mad, really, when you think about it a bit. So let's say we go into this modulation section and we could choose envelope 1, which would be our amp envelope, to do the modulation of the amount. So this envelope shape now adds movement to that parameter. So I hope you guys and girls are following this. If you've got any questions or you get a little lost, do drop them in the chat and I would be very happy to explain or slow down and go back. But hopefully those of you who are tuned into the stream are following along with this look at drift and making these chords kind of a bit more interesting and nice and using all the tools that we have in the toolbox here. So let's try changing it from envelope 1 to envelope 2. And then let's go to envelope 2. So I'm using chords that I've triggered up here, but if I was playing these in, have a listen to what sort of happens if we just play one chord here. Let's go up an octave. So we can play around a bit with that. Let's come back to our envelope a bit. So it sounds delayed, right? And we could really play around with how long it takes before that chord. So I'm just playing a stab here and then letting it go. And that chord's nicely plucking away till it disappears down here. So if we bring down the amount a bit, right? So I'll play a fast chord here. So I'm playing a really fast chord, but it's nicely continuing on here. And if we want a bit less release, so playing around with the envelopes changes how that behaves. So we've got a lot of scope there. To mess around with this kind of fake delay essentially, but it's the LFO and the envelopes that are essentially controlling the filter frequency and giving us that fake delay feeling. What do you do? Just reading in the comments, Adrian Dandas, what do you do if you want to visualize the effect of the envelope? Yeah, that's a great question. Or where there is no point on using graphs and we should guide ourselves by our ears. Well, I think the one place that we've got these days at Ableton where we can do this if we need a visual kind of feedback on the envelope. First of all, there's some great synths that give you that. Two of them are third party though, which is Serum and Pigments. They both actually show you where you are within the envelopes, which I think is a great feature. Hopefully that will come to Ableton in the future in the GUI. But what you can do is grab yourself something like the Ableton's MIDI ADSR, but actually I don't think you'll see that again, unfortunately. Like you can, see your envelope and you can map it to anything, anywhere you like, but actually you're not going to see the progress of the sound over the envelope. But I think the main thing is when you're working with envelopes is always to remind yourself that the whole stage of the envelope, the ADSR, attack, decay, sustain, release, it's happening based around when the notes are being triggered. So every time these notes trigger, that is the behavior in envelope. It's opening and closing, it's going through that ADSR motion once those notes trigger, right? But yeah, it is a great question. I have used in one of those, I think it was part one of the synth series, I used Pigments because that is a synth that allows us to see that. So if we just quickly take a look at Pigments and we drag a Pigments in, we can actually, the thing is, I'm not kind of mainly want to work with Ableton tools, so those people who have Ableton can obviously get the maximum amount of that without spending money on third-party plugins. But Arturis Pigments is a great example of envelopes where you actually see what happens over the progress of the envelope. So if we look at the amp envelope here, you can see and hear the attack and the sustain and the release phase all in action. And you can kind of learn, it's very useful for learning. Let's make it all the phases happen here. And then so you get the same in Arturia. If you then apply a filter to that, let's just actually scrap this sound here. Let's go to template. Let's go to default. We'll get back out of there. I'll go down an octave for Pigments. So let's do that. So we've just got this basic sound. Let's bring up our waveform a little bit. So if we now put a filter into the action here, and we put envelope 2 here, okay, and we assign that to the cutoff. Again, in Pigments, you can now see what the filter is doing in its envelope phase and how it's opening and closing the filter, which you can actually also see the opening and closing of the filter in the wavetable in Ableton. But in all, Pigments is probably, and Sierra, the best suggestion if you're a very visual learner and you want to see the movement of your playing or the trigger of the chords or the notes going through the cycle of the envelope. That's the answer that I have for you there. So I hope that's useful. But in Ableton, we don't really have that. It is down to using our ears, and if you're very used to working with synthesizers, which is kind of what we were trying to break through a bit with the 3-part series that I did, and now today looking at Drift, you're going to come across envelopes all the time and LFOs, using them together, using them on their own, and you want to just understand that stage of the envelope is, in this case, on the Drift, it was influencing the opening and closing of the filter at one point, and now it's influencing also the amount of the LFO. And so you can use the envelope cycle to do quite a lot of movement and modulation. I'm just going to have a sip of tea here. Adrian, for me, it's more than a valid reason to invest in pigments. Yeah, I think it's a fantastic synth. Well, it's a very powerful synth, actually, in a lot of ways. I'd be very happy to do a stream just on pigments if there's a few people who'd like to see that. We can do similar to this. We could do a track in pigments instead of drift, and work through it, but it is a good one for visual learners in terms of understanding that envelope phase. As I said, if we do grab wavetable from Ableton, it is a useful one. If we copy our chords over to the wavetable and we just dive into the matrix here. So in the wavetable, we have our filter section over here, and we have two envelopes essentially given to us in wavetable, and they're not applied to anything. They're free. They're free ADSR envelopes, which is a source of modulation that we can apply wherever we like, wherever we'd like to have something work with an envelope. And so what we can do here straight away in the wavetable is grab our filter frequency, bring it right down like so, then pop over to the matrix and give it 100% that the frequency cutoff is now going to be modulated by envelope 2. And you can now see the phase of the envelope and the triggering of the chord. So if you pay attention to the movement of that, let's just do this. This is helpful, I think, because now you'll see when the envelope opens. So you can see the modulation of the filter frequency every time those chords trigger. So it's not just me sort of speaking about that, now you can actually see it. So if we change this envelope around a bit, if I bring down the sustain, you can see this, that it behaves quite different, because now it's shutting that filter off very, very fast. It goes up to the stage of the envelope quickly, down to the decay, and there is no sustain and release. So the filter opens and closes very, very pluckily and fast at the start of the chords being triggered. But if we do this, now they blur. It's hard to hear where the chords start because the envelope is open and sustaining over the top. So when the first chord happens, it's because it's sustained and open, the filter stays open and it goes right across into a big blur here. So let's come down somewhere in between. And you can see the movement of the frequency. And so if we slow down the attack, it could be nice as well with a filter envelope, because it gives us our sort of wah-wah, almost sort of that nice sound. So lots and lots of sort of shape and movement we can have there. And one of my favorite things is to kind of have a filter envelope that's giving this our movement already right off the start. So every time the chords happen, our filters opening and closing. And if we want, we can now automate this. But we've got that movement going on all the time, and we can still open and close our cutoff as well as that. So that movement's in the background almost. Right, so we've still got this that we could automate through our track. And what's another fun thing to do then here in the wavetable for me is similar to what I was doing in the drift, is I would now go to the matrix and I now can add to the very same frequency cutoff. I've got an envelope 100% positive opening up from that cutoff point. So if we go the other way, if we go negative, just to show you as well, it's going to be, we won't hear anything really because the cutoff's already very low. So we don't hear anything. But if we bring our cutoff to the middle or almost fully open, now it's working the reverse direction. So we need to bring our attack back a little bit, or our release a little bit. Otherwise we kind of have that clicky. So that's doing the reverse. It's closing the filter down from wherever we've got the cutoff set. But we need to work on it just a little bit in that direction. So we have less sort of clickiness, but that's a bit of the combination of the amp envelope with the filter envelope, but it's a little bit smoother now. But it's closing the filter down each time those chords trigger. Okay, so I'm going to go back to the filter envelope 100% in the positive direction. So we've got that movement. And now I'm going to bring an LFO also onto the frequency cutoff to sort of modulate on top of the envelope, and then we start to get more movement. Because the thing is, if we take the envelope off, right, so this is the main difference between LFOs and envelopes. Envelopes are reacting to the start of these chords being triggered, and an LFO doesn't care about that. It cares about the cycle of the LFO. It's like an, you know, it's an endless cycle. The envelope is an envelope and that goes through the attack, decay, sustain, release phases when the notes are triggered. An LFO doesn't care about that. The only thing an LFO does care about is whether it's re-triggered or not. If it's not re-triggered, it can re-trigger from anywhere in the cycle, and that can sound a bit strange, and you can get pops and clicks. It can be also quite nice. Something to try. It's there for a reason, but if you set it to re-trigger, it will always start when it's finished its cycle to re-trigger the same cycle. So it won't start from the top of the sine wave or the bottom or the middle or anywhere unusual. It'll start from the very beginning every single time. So it's a more consistent LFO. So if we take off the envelope to 0 and we now put an LFO here, we've got a cyclic movement on the cutoff, right? So if we put the frequency in the middle here, the chords will trigger the same as they were before. But now the LFO is opening and closing the filter through this cycle. So if we slow down the cycle, very slowly opens the cutoff, and same as the envelope, if it's positive or negative, it's either going to open the filter in positive from the cutoff, or if it's negative, it's going to close it down from that point. That doesn't change. Envelope or LFO, if it's minus, closing down from the cutoff point. If it's positive, opening up from that point. So I hope that helps. But an LFO is like this constant cycle. Right, so if we now speed this up, let's bring it down a bit from 100% so it's not as extreme now. %20 could be nice. And then we can mess around with all the waveforms. So right now it's a sine wave. It's also in frequency, so it's not syncing to the grid all the time. So if we have our drums, it's working independently to that. But if we turn on note sync up here, we can now have it sync to eighth notes. So every time an eighth notes happen, the cycle of the LFO is triggering. Or if we have a 16th note, every one of these 16th notes is triggering the cycle. Well, let's do square wave. So you can go through all of these waveforms. So not only do we have frequency, which keeps us off the grid and in between the grid, we've got note sync, so we can sync it up with the grid a bit if we wish, and our other elements, so it follows a cycle of 16th notes or eighths or quarter notes or triplets even. Then we've got random waveforms, square waveforms, sawtooths, triangles, and sine waves. We've got our amount, how much of that LFO is being applied, and the destination. So again, with all of these modulation sources, we've got sources, envelopes, LFOs, and destinations. Where are they being applied? So right now we're applying LFO to filter frequency, and we had the envelope also applied there. So these are the sources. Yes, and the destination are the locations they're being applied to. So coming back to something I quite like to do here, again, if I put my cutoff right down and I give myself envelope, chords are triggering the filter to open up and open in the cycle of this envelope too. And now I can also use an LFO to modulate around on top of what the envelope is doing. And we can make it really subtle. And there's all sorts of things we can do. We can even also fade the LFO in so it doesn't LFO right at the start of each time the cycle triggers, it fades in from that point. So there's a lot of advanced stuff we can do here, but that would be a common sort of move for me to do this, where I would, you know, as I said, have an envelope moving my filter around. That's a nice movement. Every chord triggers it. And then this LFO creating more and more interest to the sound. And as I said, it can be very subtle like we've got here now with the LFO, that is. And it's just giving extra movement here. So if we take the envelope away, it's what things would sound like with just the LFO doing its cycle. And if we now add a bit of envelope to that, we're going to open and close this wobbling cutoff point with the triggering of the start of the chords. Just playing around, this is the filter envelope that I'm adjusting here, and that's just affecting again what's going on in the background with that movement. That's nice. So you can now really hear the filter being pulled down, but we've still got that nice little wobble on the top. Or we could go the other way. And this is a great way to learn this, because the filter frequency cutoff is something we generally like to play around with a lot. But these envelopes and these LFOs, they can be used to do the same as what we're doing here to the filter cutoff, but to many other things, such as maybe the, we could also have the resonance being wobbled by the LFO or the envelope. We can have the wavetable position in the wavetable synth being modulated by those two sources, the destination being moving through the wavetable. We can modulate pretty much everything around the synth, can have some movement from those. And I've got a spare envelope here, and I've got a spare LFO here. And so those can be doing something completely different. This can be a short, plucky envelope that we apply to things, and this can be a long, slow, slowly opening and closing envelope. The LFO too, I often do two LFOs, one that's contrast to the other on purpose. So I've got a fast moving LFO that can move things around quickly, and a slow moving one. And then if you run out of those two, and this is where the fun begins here in Ableton Live, if either of those are not enough modulation, then we can go over to our MIDI effects here, and we've got, sorry, Ableton 12, we separated it to modulators tab, and we can go here and we can grab ourselves envelope MIDI, and so we've now got a spare envelope that can be mapped anywhere we like. Amazing. And again, we can adjust it all like we're learning to adjust. We also have then a page of where that could be mapped to, up to 10 different locations. So that is brilliant in itself. And then we've got LFO. And again, we could have as many of these as we like. So nobody could come to me, I believe, and tell me that, I'm sorry, we don't have enough sources of modulation available to us, because we do. And both these two devices are amazing, and they've had updates, so they've got more depth to them than they ever had before. So in terms of possibilities for making your music more interesting for the listener, more dynamic, more evolving, there's a lot to look at under the hood there. Just going to grab a bit of tea. Adrian, I love this. When I tweak with synths, I'm always going in this direction of creating evolving sounds, and envelopes and LFOs are the first tools that I play with. Yeah, I think it's a really good thing to do that as well. Make them the first, your go-to tools to play with, because as I said, effects are great, but perhaps we understand more about this and we can push this as far as we can, rather than our go-to just being reaching for effects and hoping that if we drop them after the synth, that we get the answer we're looking for straight away. We can learn a lot about making really, really interesting patches by using these modulation sources. And what I love about it is, if you're good at this, it's very hard for the listener to tell. We've got one track here, and if we push this wavetable to modulate, we've got one oscillator at the moment. We've got 3 oscillators possible here. We've got just the movement of the filter frequency, and already we might think that's still one synth, which it is. But if we start to sort of get a little bit more involved, well, you know, suddenly we can make this sound like it. And the beauty of it is that it is one track in your project, one MIDI clip, one set of chords that feels like it's a lot more than that. And as I said, tip of the iceberg stuff here. So if we get a more complex waveform, and let's have the wavetable being modulated a bit by envelope 2. But again, we need to pick, maybe we'll go back to basics, but we'll look for something. Right, sounds nice. So now we've got a little bit more movement going on, and then if we were to put oscillator 2 in, let's get something that's a bit of noise perhaps. And let's have oscillator 2 be the wavetable position, be moved with that sort of faster LFO. And then we could put our faster LFO back on oscillator 1, and we could do a bit of fold, or maybe even a little bit of FM. So let's put the amount of that with the envelope 2. And we start to get, you know, as I said, more and more action happening here. And yeah, away you go with your creativity and imagination here. But get everything moving and working. And as I said, if what I'd really like if I was pushing this further sound design wise is to be really confused as to whether that is just one sound, one patch, or it's multiple instruments playing that chord pattern or something like that. That's the sort of goal in my mind when I'm doing this. I'm trying to really kind of confuse the listener. Not that it's bad sounds or bad chords or bad music, but confuse them. They think it's a lot more than it is. It means very economically I'm just using one wavetable and one track to kind of get the sort of sound I'm looking for. Yeah, so you can really dive in here and start to get sort of, so if I was setting homework, I'd be saying, really try and squeeze your patches, really try and get the sound to confuse the listener into thinking, well, this person's got like 5 instruments going on there to get that kind of sound. So just checking back in the comments, Adrian, you've been busy there. One can create macros so these parameters can be changed live and provide this illusion that you are bringing different patches when you are just sculpt. Absolutely. Perhaps you meant you want to puzzle the listener and make things intrigued about what they're hearing. Definitely my kind of sound. Yeah, it's about sort of, of course, working in a musical sense, but just being something more, the three-dimensional and not one-dimensional. And modulation is a huge key to unlocking that door. Instead of having a very static chord patch that sounds extremely boring, it suddenly becomes a moving, evolving piece of music. Right, so let's get back over to Drift for a second. We were sort of stuck in here, and we were playing around with envelopes and filters and looking at what the Drift is capable of. Same chords. So I was kind of trying to make this fake delay, which again is if we turn off the LFO, that's what our chords sound like, right? And so we've got an amp envelope, we've got a filter envelope, and the filter envelope too is being applied to the cutoff. So it's just gently, again, re-triggering this filter. So we could do the same thing as we did with the wavetable, but you won't see it this time. But every time these chords start, this frequency cutoff is being affected by the amount of envelope 2. So this envelope here, as you can hear, if I change that, but if I make the envelope fairly neutral, there's a little bit of movement. Let's make it fairly, just reset it to its kind of standard shape. And let's bring it down a bit. So it's just a very gentle bit of envelope on our cutoff. But if we add our LFO that we've got over here now, so the LFO is sawtooth down waveform, note synced from the selection up here, and the destination is also the frequency cutoff over here. We get that nice kind of prog house. Sounds like we chopped the chords up. And now I'm making the amp envelope extremely short. So if we take away again our modulation, that's our amp envelope. And I've deactivated both the filter envelope. Well, it's got a little bit of, tiny bit of filter envelope, and the amp envelope is very short and plucky. Let's bring in a bit of LFO. And we haven't even started playing around with the sound of the actual. All right, and so now let's use a bit of envelope 2 to move the amount of LFO over here. So sometimes when you're doing this, you might lose track a little bit of what you're assigning where, but that's the thing, you just need to sort of have a bit of a plan and have a bit of a map of what you're trying to do. So right now we're sort of saying, okay, frequency cutoff is our main destination. We're messing around with wobbling this frequency cutoff, and we're moving it at the moment, not with much envelope, but lots of this LFO we've chosen up here. And then what I'm now messing around with is the amount of this LFO, how much of that LFO is wobbling the frequency cutoff, and I'm using an envelope to move this around. And so that's what I mean. That's modulating the modulator in this case. We're saying, okay, give me a bit of envelope 2 and let's modulate this amount. And if you dig into here, you can actually see there's some other possibilities. So we could basically play around with the amount of the LFO with any of these sources. Envelope 1, so our envelope would work. Envelope 2, which is our envelope down here, will work at doing that. We can also use the LFO to modulate itself. So it's going to be working on itself to move this amount around. We'll have a listen to what that sounds like in a moment. We can have key and velocity, which is also interesting. So if we go up in pitch, the rate, the amount changes. If we change it to be velocity, the harder and softer notes will wiggle this. Amazing, really. And then you've got the MPE, pressure and slide, and the mod wheel if you've got the wheel on the side of your synth. So all of those things could be moving the amount of the drift LFO. And if I do it with the mouse, so I turn off everything here, let's make sure we've got, actually we'll need LFO. So let's have the LFO on the filter frequency cutoff. And now I'll just do this with the mouse. So if we say it's the LFO doing it to itself, this is now getting movement via this. Pretty crazy. If we choose one of our envelopes, such as 2, now this cycle is affecting this amount. But that's a fairly subtle one. That's not something you're going to hear leaping off the page straight away, but we are making that amount move around a little bit, which is adding some more interest in the background there to whatever we're doing over here. So let's go back to envelope 2, having a bit of envelope on the drift filter as well. And let's maybe duplicate the drift over, and yeah, let's give ourselves a whole other copy of it. And on this second one over here, instead of the amount being modulated here of the LFO, let's go now for something else that we could do here with modulating the modulator. So in the drift here, we've also got this modulation page, and if we open up the modulation page, we can see that we've got 3 sections to it, and at the very top you're deciding what is the source, what is doing the modulation. So again, a little bit like we're looking at down here, this is the sources. The destination here is the amount of the LFO, right? This section, they're tied together. And over here, the sources can be chosen from here and here. And as you can see, we can have 2, and both of those are affecting the cutoff, right? And because I've put the LFO onto the cutoff, it's affecting it. And because envelope 2 is onto the cutoff, they're both affecting that at the moment. But if we go into this page here, well, we could now say, okay, let's have envelope 2 and let's have it affect something else. And you can see if we open up the destination page in this area, we can see some new things. Oscillator 1 gain, nice, way over here. Oscillator 1 shape, nice, way over here. Oscillator 2 gain, oscillator 2 detuning, low pass frequency, high pass resonance, high pass frequency. So we can get stuck into both of these. We can play around with the level of the noise. We can adjust the rate of the LFO, and that's what I'm looking for here. So if I put LFO rate as the selection there, I'm now saying that envelope 2, our friend down here, is, let's make it 100%, is now affecting this up here, the rate. So we've now got even more complexity going on. So let's put this in hertz, so it's in frequency, and so now this is being adjusted by envelope 2 at the moment. Let's have a listen to that. Let's play around with envelope 2 a bit. Try a different waveform. I'm going to go back to sawtooth down. But again, we've just kind of evolved things a little bit further by bringing in this page here. So drift is pretty powerful, I would have to say. So let's maybe look at something else we can do here, because I think it gets a bit more interesting. So we understand ADSR envelopes, and we hopefully by now, and we understand LFOs and the different waveforms we've got going on here. Now, sometimes throwing another little thing into the hat is that sometimes envelopes can be looped, and so they can actually work like an LFO. So they do the cycle and then they loop back on themselves. Now in the drift, we don't have a looping envelope, but what we do have is a cycling envelope. So if we click down here, oh, the envelope 2 becomes another cycling waveform, and it's kind of effectively like an LFO, but with a little bit of a difference. So we've now changed, and you do it just here, we've now changed envelope 2 into a cycling envelope, like so. And as you can see, it's got like a triangle type waveform at the moment. If we move this tilt, kind of get that kind of almost like a sidechain shape, sawtooth up or sawtooth down, but with some sort of variation to it. So we get that nice kind of shape that we can mess around with there. We can also virtually turn it into a square wave of sorts or change the whole section of it. Which is interesting for sure. And then we have the rate, same as an LFO. So we should be familiar with that. And we see down here, we've got all the different possibilities of having it note synced or in frequency or in the time domain or in this one-to-one, which I'll explain in a moment, which as you can see, if we do one-to-one, that changes things to a ratio. So let's go to Hertz. We're introducing this for the first time. And now we can sort of say that wherever envelope 2 is being applied, it's kind of being applied like an LFO, right? So let's say that we already have an LFO on the frequency cutoff here. So let's zero out the envelope 2 there, or we could even change it to something we're not using, let's say mod wheel. So we don't have any envelope being applied to the cutoff. We've got our friend the LFO being applied to the cutoff. Let's make it 100%. So we've currently got what we have over here. Let's take this off as well for a second, okay, and zero that out. So the amount is 100% of a saw down at this rate, moving the frequency cutoff. We need to go in here, we need to clear that as well. Okay, so let's start. Let's just set that back up to note sync for a second. Cool. So let's say that now we've got envelope 2 as a cycling envelope, like an extra LFO. Well, if we go back to the amount of the actual LFO and we say give envelope 2 cycle the opportunity to modulate this, now we can bring up the amount there. And now this here is being modulated by this. Instead of the ADSR envelope, it's now being modulated by this cycling envelope. Which can get really interesting. So who's lost? Hopefully nobody. So let's note sync the envelope 2, but let's have it to quarter notes. So it's a different rate to the LFO on the cutoff. So it's getting quite kind of weird, wonderful and wonky, and you can get noise in here, or you can get all sorts of kind of experiments. So essentially this envelope 2 here is now like an LFO modulating an LFO's amount. That's what's going on here. So we can go back to that little experiment we did a second ago where we dug into the modulation page, and here I think it's going to make more sense. So let's put this back a little bit to its defaults, something like that. And let's say that the amount we're going to leave alone, we're not going to have that modulated by anything. So we're going to reset that. So LFO still on the cutoff of the filter frequency, still working on this. Applied 100% down here, and the amount of the LFO, as you can see, it's 100%. And now we're going to go into the modulation page, and we're going to have envelope 2 cycling. If it wasn't chosen already, we would choose it from here, and we're now going to have it on the rate of the LFO. So instead of it being an ADSR envelope that's being triggered by the chords, it's now going to wobble this amount here again, but now with this. Okay, so let's take it out of note sync, put it in hertz, have a listen. Let's make it quite strong in here, just so it's obvious what's going on. If we note sync it up, so there's a lot of fun to be had in there, and you can again experiment around. So this is a bit of a hidden thing, or it's not necessarily hidden, but I'm not sure that everybody knows that envelope 2 in the drift can be a cycling envelope. Think of it like an extra LFO, so we didn't have to go reaching for, Ableton's LFO devices. We can switch that envelope over from a regular ADSR envelope into a cycling envelope. And we've got this lovely tilt feature that we can move it between all those different waveforms. And we've got all the LFO capabilities of syncing it to note values or having it in frequency. And again, through this modulation pages, we can take it to interesting destinations and choose it in different places where we want to modulate something. So what I was just doing a moment ago was using this cycling envelope to modulate the rate of the LFO that we've got going on in this drift at the moment. Still a bit of the tip of the iceberg stuff here, to be honest, but we've probably listened to these chords a fair bit, so maybe we should make something else with the drift and play around a bit more. So let's have a new MIDI track, brand new one. Let's grab ourselves another Ableton Live drift, drop it over here. And by the way, if you are joining the stream or you're in the stream, we've had plenty of interaction with Adrian. Thanks for your great questions and comments there. Do join us in the chat, say hello, let us know where you're tuning in and listening from. If you do have any questions, drop them in there. I had a couple of polls running on my community tab and also earlier on in the chat, asking people what they'd like to which synth within Ableton's folder sort of instruments would they like to learn a bit more about, and Drift was the winner, so kind of digging into Drift here at the moment, taking a look at what it can do. All right, so let's maybe see if we can make with Drift something like a tasty acid sequence. So let's grab the Sting by our friend Ifta. If you don't have this, you can download it on the Max for Live community page. What I can do is drop a link in the description. for sure of the video. Once I've ended the live stream, I can pop a little link in there down to download this handy little sequencer that's great for coming up with acid sequences, let's say, and we're going to turn the drift synth into that sequence. We're also going to come back and visit those chords, and we're also going to still unpack what this one-to-one is all about as well, what that actually brings to the table, because we've kind of dug in a little bit to the drift, but we also haven't played with still all the possibilities that are there under the hood. So let's just make a new sound just for a variation. And let's just mess around with the sequence for a moment until we find something we like. And if you just click the smiley face, and let's turn off, just have oscillator 1 for a moment. Let's try it with the chords as well. Yeah, it could work. Just wanted to check that. So maybe we'll roll with this sequence for a moment. So let's do a few changes to drift. We don't need it to be polyphonic. We're going to have a monophonic line here. And hopefully then we can get a bit of glide if the notes are overlapping. Which is a classic kind of TV303 thing. And if you change the density knob over here, so if you're only looking for a few notes, but the more notes we have here and the more overlap, then our glide's kind of getting stuck in here. Let's bring down the volume velocity on the drift. Well, what we're going to do in a moment is we are going to use velocity to move our cutoff around a bit. So let's bring down the envelope. Make it plucky for a moment. And let's bring up our resonance. So let's have down in here, because this little sequencer here, the Sting by Ifta, is giving us the little pattern. And by the way, you can click over here if you like, and if you want a MIDI clip and to switch the sequencer off and don't use it anymore, you can just click clip there and you get a lovely clip up here of the notes that it's playing at the moment, which is fantastic. It's a great little device. So we're going to leave it like it is, but you can do that. You can also input MIDI into it. And we've got accents going on at a value of 50 here, which means there's a little bit of velocity changes going on within the notes. And you can see that down here when I printed the clip, right? So there's velocity, kind of some notes are being accented and others are not. You can kind of see that here. And what we can do with that is actually use that to do another thing in drift here. So we can sort of go down to the frequency of our filter cutoff again. And in the modulation section, we're going to ask velocity to move the frequency around a bit. Let's listen to what that sounds like. So you get those kind of little accent notes. They're kind of moving a bit around this filter cutoff for us. And we can play around with the amount just to get the sort of amount that we want of that. But kind of a key was taking the volume to velocity off. because if this is on, it's kind of affecting a little bit the result we're getting there. Okay, let's play around with the volume of oscillator 1. So that makes a big difference as well on the drift. These are dynamic and they react with each other. So you've got the frequency cutoff, opening and closing the filter, and the volume of oscillator 1, the level, is interacting with that. So don't be afraid to push this around to find the sort of sound you're looking for. So if we change it from a sawtooth to a square, that was the two TB303 oscillator shapes. Playing around with the amp envelope at the moment. Now those chords, we might need to start again a little bit with the modulation on those. They're very much demonstration. The chords could work, but all the modulation I've done up till now with the two drifts and the wavetable weren't working with this sequence that we've now got. So we might need to dial that in, and I'm not sure also about the chord progression yet, but I quite like this acid sequence now. Let's add a bit of noise. So as we've printed the clip up here, we can go and change the sequence, look for something else, knowing that we can, if we lose this, we've actually saved the sequence that we've got here. So I'm going to roll the dice. Bring in oscillator 2. So ladies and gents, welcome to the Drift, doing some acid kind of sounds. I think it's a very, very capable synth for this kind of type of sound design. Let's go back to a sawtooth here. Triangle's nice. I think that's my favorite. So let's spice up this patch a little bit here. So I've just been moving around, like I'm going outside of the Roland TB3303 territory now. I've got 2 oscillators, I've got a noise oscillator, so really 3. I've got a different wave shape here. If we were sticking to TB303 authentic, we'd either be sawtooth or square wave. We'd be 1 oscillator, and we'd be working with the rest of the synth pretty much like it is. But as we can kind of go a little bit wild here, let's go a little bit wild. Let's also do a bit of modulation then. So let's have this LFO here. So one thing that we haven't done yet with the drift is that up in the oscillator 1 section, where we see next to the shape, this parameter here, we've got right next door the option to, again, have, it's a destination, so we can have a source modulate that. So let's say we take the LFO and we use the LFO over here to modulate the shape parameter here. So let's say we say 100% LFO to modulate this. Let's leave the LFO as it is for a moment. Okay, let's note sync the rate. So you can see already the movement that that's causing here. And you can kind of hear it. Let's change our waveform. So this moving of the shape is creating that really lovely tone that we've got now. So if we take 100% of the LFO modulating this away, that's what it sounds like without it. Depending on your waveform, as you can hear, you're getting all sorts of beautiful tones out of that. From sort of dirty, overdriven to clean. To quite bonkers on the sawtooth, right? So if we now come to the LFO and we change its rate and waveform, just depends what you're going for, right? All right, let's get a new track in. Let's get our drift chords over, and let's now see if we can make a nice drift to complement this. Let's get a new drift. So I'm just got a very basic drift patch here, playing these chords back at the moment. Just keep them at that octave. That's our ADSR envelope. Now let's work on a little bit of movement. Okay, so I think we'll do that with a cycling envelope. So just dialing in a few things there. So also with the drift, I haven't been chatting for a moment, just been getting sort of going down the rabbit hole of playing around with all this. So hopefully you saw a little bit what I was doing there. Obviously I was playing around with the different oscillator shapes. And again, modulating this shape parameter is really nice on oscillator 1. And I'm using, again, the cyclic envelope of the envelope 2 that we have here in Drift, which I think is really, really interesting. We can use envelope 1 in other places as a source of modulation anyway, but wherever we've got envelope 2 at the moment, map 2, we're bringing this cyclic waveform to the amount of the LFO, and it's also changing the shape over here, and I think it's kind of really, really interesting. Let's look at the one-to-one in a second, what that's all about. But I'm kind of happy-ish with how that sounds on the chord track and the acid sequence together. And no effects or processing, as I said, so definitely on this chord track, would like a couple of things just to polish the sound a little bit. Have a bit of chorus and some reverb. And then we're just going to dial these things back a little bit. All right, let's see what else we can come up with here. Maybe we can come up with a quick little drift bass line to go with that. If we just pitch up the acid sequence a little bit. Let's get another drift in. And let's, well, we might just, yeah, I'm not sure, bring that back down an octave. We'll just maybe make this one lower. All right, so let's go to drift and let's use some of Ableton's MIDI tools on this one. See if we can do a quick little bass line idea to go with this. By the way, if you are in the live stream with me, do feel free to say hello in the chat. And if you've got any questions, feel free to drop them in there as well. Let us know how you're doing. And thanks for tuning in. Today is sort of a little exploring this idea here. The focus has been on Ableton Live's Drift, as I did a couple little polls asking people which synth instrument would they like to learn. And the options were meld, drift, operator analog, or what else do we have in there? Drift, wavetable. So the winning percentage was on the drift, but all of those other synths we'll cover as well in future streams for sure. So let's use some of Ableton's tools. So let's get this down here. We're just going to bring this lane down a little bit here. Let's jump into the Generate tab. Let's jump into the seeds. Let's turn off auto for a second and just have a look what we got going on first. So let's aim for a bass line. We're in E, so maybe we can set the root note to be E0. That's pretty low. We're going to kick drum down there somewhere. So maybe we have E1. We don't need to go up to C5. Maybe we could have some high notes in the 3 register. Probably 2 would be enough. So let's maybe just bring that somewhere in the 2s. There we go. Okay, 64th notes. Don't think I'd want any of those. 30 seconds could be interesting. 8th notes, maybe we'll have a quarter note or 2. Velocity range, I'm okay with. Voices, let's come down to 1 and let's hit auto. So we go, we've got a bit of a riff. And let's maybe populate it a bit more with the density. So let's maybe try these down lower. So just while we're working on this little bass synth idea, we're going to put it in mono. Nice. So similarly to what we did a little bit with the acid synth, we could also have a little bit of velocity modulating the cutoff. So let's set that to 0 and let's have the filter frequency, but the modulation of it to come from velocity. We'll bring it down a little bit. Could have some glides. We don't want it too similar to the acid synth line. Just kind of way, we might go back to the clip of drift of the acid line. So what we might do is turn off the sequencer, play the clip, and then I'm going to pitch these notes up a little bit. And let's try some of these high notes out. Or pitch down a bit. So bearing in mind, folks, this has been quite a demonstration of drift. I didn't kind of compose everything to be the perfect result for a finished track or musical idea. I often try and make things sort of sound musical by the time we get towards the end of the stream, which is a little bit what I'm doing at the moment. But yeah, I haven't set out on a big mission here today to nail the perfect music idea with everything kind of working beautifully in sync musically. But there's a few things that fit together here, and that's sort of what I'm working on. But mainly, we've been trying to put drift through its paces and see kind of the hidden or not so obvious features and how much modulation you can do in it and how interesting you can make these patches and make them come alive. How well does it do bass lines? How well does it do acid? How well does it do chords? I think pretty good. So let's just have a look at these two patterns over the top of each other as well. Yeah, that helps them fit around each other a little bit better. Okay, so let's unpack the last thing about drift here, just using one of these example drifts. So let's maybe duplicate that track over and we'll just have a look here. And what we want to do, so that little music idea, as I said, it's kind of run its point to where it is now with those, I think, 4 instances playing together. We could also do something fun here as well. Why don't we just try maybe chopping those? And maybe what we'll do is just have a bit of a 8th dotted kind of pattern. See what that sounds like. Just every couple of 16ths in between where I'm just muting there. See what that sounds like. All right, so this extra drift I've just added over here. Let's have a quick look at something here. So in the modulation or the LFO tab, let's say, let's start with a brand new drift. And we'll just quickly take a look at one last feature of the LFO section, which is that we've got kind of frequency, hertz, the rate of the LFO, we've got time, so we can do it in seconds, and we've got note sync, but we've got this 1-to-1, and if you look at where we change that, we get ratio showing up. And what it is that we can basically get kind of almost FM or amplitude, AM, FM rates here, very fast audio rates on the LFO. So the ratio and switching it to 1-to-1, you can get a very, very fast ratio, much faster than you could do in a traditional rate sense of frequency. So you can apply that, and it also is a feature of the LFO, and it's also then a feature of the cycling envelope. So if we switch envelope 2 to being cycling, can also make that audio rate. So if you're looking to get some sort of noise or dirt or something like that, it could be a very good way to do that. So let's maybe see if we can find an example of doing that. Let's do it with the LFO as a starting point. So let's just play this drift. And let's bring our cutoff down like we've been doing. Got our chords there. We've got our envelope, standard stuff. Let's set it to the ratio or LFO, and let's apply it to the filter cutoff. So we've got a really nice sort of tone out of it. So it's quite musical. And if you go in between, so here's the tip. Here we're opening and closing or modulating the filter cutoff. If it's solid numbers, like 1.0, the ratio, then is in pitch, in tune. But if you go outside of those ratios in between whole numbers, you're going to get sort of like, more aggressive kind of weird atonal sounds. So 2, but if we start going between 2 and 3, you can hear again when we land on 3, we're back into a ratio and tune, just like FM. So as you can hear, it's kind of quite interesting. So let's now use it elsewhere. Let's have it on the amount. So let's maybe make envelope 2 also in the ratio. And let's apply envelope 2 to the amount of LFO. So you're getting that sort of crunchy, grimy kind of texture in there, and things could get pretty wild with that pretty quickly. So it's kind of in there to give us something like we find in the real synth world, modular synths and a lot of hardware synths. We have LFOs that they go to audio rates, which means they can cycle very, very fast and essentially give us, as I said, FM or AM amplitude modulation. So let's say we change this one to envelope 2, the cycling envelope in the mod page, and we're going to take on the LFO rate with that. Come back, so we're going to modulate this with this. So you can get kind of some really kind of analogy texture in there using the 1-to-1 section of the LFO or the cycling envelope. Pretty cool little feature in there. The rest of the drift, I think we've explored it pretty good today. The modulation page here, we have only used like one sort of section of it, but obviously we've got more, and they all default to something like velocity. But again, we can choose sources here and then the destination of where we're going with that. And so if we wanted to make a really, again, patch that really evolves and does a lot of things, we can get stuck in here and we can choose things, again, like this envelope here, the cycling envelope, but where we can apply it, it goes a lot further. We can apply it to oscillator gain, so we could do tremolo. We can apply it to the shape, which is really interesting. Let's do that just quickly. So let's have this instead. We'll just change this back to, we'll change it to oscillator 1 shape. So now we're using this cycling LFO to modulate the shape of LFO1, this section here, this section. So we'll listen to that. So now we're affecting this with that very fast modulation down here. And depending on which oscillator type we have, which waveform, you can get some really nice tones in there with that very, very fast ratio audio rate LFO, either cycling envelope 2 or using it in the LFO section and applying it to some sort of destination. In this case, this oscillator 1 shape again is very, very interesting, because actually I just realized I hadn't actually applied it properly. So now let's try that again. Yeah, that's better. So you can see it responding. So lots of ways in Drift to wiggle and move filters, envelopes, sections of the synth, and get a way, way more interesting patch and movement, and entertain your listeners, add depth to your music, make it three-dimensional, make it stand out from the crowd. That's kind of what these experiments are about, and what this learning is about, these discoveries are about. They're about increasing your depth and filling in the gaps in your knowledge and understanding, so that you can find your own sound out there. There are many people just grab a preset, stick it on the track, make some MIDI, happy days, and there's nothing wrong with that. But obviously diving into things like this and understanding it a bit more, well, hopefully that can help you unlock, new sounds in your tracks and take you into new directions. As I said, surprise yourself, surprise your listeners, and find your own very unique sound. So on that note, I'm going to wrap up today's stream. I hope you did find it beneficial. You've learned some things as I've sort of been playing around here. There'll be more synth ones. There'll be more, as I said, the poll I'll keep running on my community tab. Feel free to let me know anything you would like to learn about the synths, and I'll let that poll will keep running on there about the different Ableton synths and which ones you would prefer to learn more about them. As I said, today was a bit of a drift deep dive. So I hope you've enjoyed it. Of course, wishing you all a very, very Merry Christmas. I will probably be back on the, well, not probably, most likely, for a stream in between Christmas and the New Year's next Sunday, if that works out in and around all this time of year. But a very Merry Christmas to you all. Feliz Navidad for the Spanish speakers. And Take care of yourself. Enjoy your time with your friends and family over the festive season and the holidays. And of course, do some music if you've got some time to do it. Get stuck in, make some tracks, enjoy Ableton Live. But as I said, all the very best from me for you all for Christmas. And thanks for supporting the channel. Thanks for watching today's stream. And thanks to those of you who answered the questions I put in the poll. So as always, if you did enjoy this video, I will for sure link a video at the end card here of today's stream. The next one I would suggest you watch if you enjoyed this content, the one that will fit really well with the same theme. Take care of yourself. Merry Christmas and catch you in the next stream. This is Heath signing out. Bye for now. Ciao.